Hello everyone, welcome to the another video of Concept X. So today in this video we are going to discuss about the Tetralogy of Fallot, which is a rare congenital disease where 4 different types of defects are associated with in single condition. So Tetralogy of Fallot, it is basically from Greek origin. So Fallot means it is a scientist's name who discovered this condition. So the scientist, his name is Etienne Louis Arthur Fallot. So first in 1888 he discovered this condition. So tetralogy means 4 different types. Tetra means 4. So 4 different types of health defects we are going to study. So that's why it is called a tetralogy. Fallot means the scientist who discovered this condition. That's why it is a tetralogy of Fallot. So Fallot, this is a scientist name. So here 4 different defects are associated with tetralogy of Fallot. So number 1 defects is interventricular septal defects. So interventricular septal defects means, so this is our heart. So we can see this is our this is our right atrium, this is our right ventricle. So this is our left ventricle and this is our left atrium. So in between our right ventricle and left ventricle there is an opening. In normal human being this opening should not be there. So as it is a interventricular septal defects means there is a hole in between both the ventricles. So if there is a opening in between both the ventricles, then we can easily understand that there will be a mix-up of both deoxygenated blood which is present in our right ventricle and oxygenated blood which is present in our left ventricle. So both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can mixed up. So when ventricle contract, then both mixture of that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, it will go through this aorta. So this is our aorta. So through this aorta, this blood will go to our whole body. So through this aorta, it will go to our body parts. Means our body parts will receive oxygenated blood from our left ventricle, and because of this opening, when they both the ventricle contract, we know the both the ventricle contract simultaneously. So when left ventricle and right ventricle both they contract, the blood which is present in our right ventricle, which is supposed to go through this pulmonary artery to our both the lungs, but instead of going to our lungs, some part of our deoxygenated blood will go through this opening and it will go towards the aorta along with the oxygenated blood which is present in our left ventricle. So are you getting my point? So thing is, when both the ventricle contract, left ventricle and right ventricle, in between them there is a interventricular septal defects. Septum is defected. What kind of defects are there? That there is a opening in between our both the ventricle, and because of that opening, when both the ventricle contract, some amount of blood which is present in our right ventricle, which is deoxygenated or carbon dioxide rich blood, it will go through this opening to our left ventricle, and from left ventricle it will go through the aorta to our rest of the body parts. So that's why it is the interventricular septal defect. It is a congenital disease which is present at the time of the birth of that baby. Second one is aorta that emerges from both ventricles. Both ventricles emerges from both ventricle means aorta is actually it is connected with our left ventricle in normal human being. As there is an opening in between both the ventricle, so functionally now we can say that aorta is also emerges from our right ventricle, as there is an opening in between both the ventricle because of this interventricular septal defects. As there is a septal defects, that's why aorta Now we can say aorta is also directly connected with our right ventricle because of their opening. If there is opening was not, is there opening, there is no opening here, then we can say aorta is directly connected with our left ventricle. But now in that case, as there is an opening, so the blood which is present in our right ventricle, it can directly go to our aorta through this opening. So functionally we can say that aorta is also connected with our right ventricle. So left ventricle it is directly connected, and right ventricle it is connected through this opening. So that's why it is called that aorta that emerges from both the ventricles. So both the ventricles means right ventricle it is directly connected and left ventricle it is connected through this point. So that arrow is basically, it is indicating that aorta, the blood can go through this opening to our aorta from right ventricle also and from left ventricle also. That's why there is a two arrow which is combined this point. So this is one arrow and this is another arrow. Both the arrow they combine here, and the same mixture of the blood it will travel across the aorta. That's why it is called the aorta that emerges from both the ventricles. Actually it is not both the ventricles directly, indirectly they are connected. Like because of this opening from our left ventricle there is a direct connection. As there is an opening because of this intraventricular septal defects, because of the opening left ventricular blood can now easily travel through this opening to our aorta. That's why it is called the aorta that emerges from both the ventricle. Means aorta which is connected with our both the ventricles, no matter whether it is opening or direct connection. Blood aorta which receive blood from both the ventricle, that's why we are calling it as aorta that emerges from both the ventricles. Next is stenosed pulmonary valve. Stenosed means narrower. So we can say stenosed pulmonary valve means there is a narrow opening in between our valve. So this opening is very narrow. So here we can see other valves are, they are so much wider, but here it is a very narrower valve. That's why it is called stenosed pulmonary valve. We know that this is a pulmonary artery. As pulmonary artery we have the pulmonary valve. The main function of pulmonary valve is to block the backflow of blood which is coming from our right ventricle. When right ventricle contract, right ventricular blood it will go through the pulmonary valve to our lungs. So when right ventricle relaxes, that the blood which is present in our pulmonary artery, it should not backflow towards the right ventricle. So that's why there is a valve. This is the main function of our valves, pulmonary valve. But as there is a narrow opening, so what happened? This narrow opening, it basically not allowing the right ventricular blood to easily move through the valve. So it stenosed pulmonary valve means the valve become actually thick. So if it is a normal valve, for example this is pulmonary artery, if it is a normal valve, suppose this is the pulmonary artery, so this is our normal valve. For let's suppose this is a normal valve. So stenosed pulmonary valve means now pulmonary valve it will become like this. So because of their thickness, they lost their flexibility. So there is less flexibility. so there will be less flexibility. Here we can write that there is a more flexibility. So if our valve is a thin valve, then we can say that there is a more flexibility. But here, as the valve become more thick, so that's why they lost their flexibility. As they lost their flexibility means when right ventricle contract, these two valve or these valve is not going to open easily, because they almost lost their flexibility. It become so thick that they cannot open. They are not able to move, or they will not move even the right ventricle contract in a optimum way. So that's why what is the stenosis of pulmonary valve means? The gap between both the opening, it will become narrower. If there is a 2 millimeter, now it will become 1 millimeter. The gap between both the cups, this is the cups, so both the cups, it will lost their flexibility, and even the diameter or gap between both the cups, it will also lost. It will become smaller and thicker. So gap between both the cups, it will become more small, and the flexibility, even they lost their flexibility. So in that case, a stenos pulmonary valve means that there is a narrow opening of our pulmonary valve or pulmonary arterial valve, because they become more thick, and the gap between both the cups of our valve, it will also small according to its normal size. If initially it is 2 mm, now it become 1 mm. If there is a flexible, now it become more thick and they lost their flexibility. So next one is enlarged right ventricle. So enlarged right ventricle is, as there is a stenosed valve, means the valve is not going to open easily, and even if they open also, that gap is so small that right ventricle has to walk so much that it hardly able to push all its deoxygenated blood through this valve. Are you getting my point? The point is enlarged right ventricle means, because why this kind of situation occur, main thing is the main opening which is present in our pulmonary artery. This pulmonary opening is basically open when our right ventricle contract. When our right ventricle contract, right ventricle pushes all its content through the pulmonary artery to our lungs. So during the contraction, this pulmonary valve, it will open. But now, as there is a stenosed pulmonary valve, means pulmonary valve is already stenosed, means it becomes so thick, and the gap is also become small. So through this small opening, if right ventricle has to push all its content, then obviously right ventricle has to work so much, because usually this opening is broader, but now because of this stenosis, this gap between both the cups of our right pulmonary arterial valve, it will become narrower. As it is a narrow opening, so our right ventricle has to work so hard to push all its content through this narrow opening. So we know that it is a muscle layer. So continuously, when right ventricular muscle continuously work so hard to push its content through this small opening of our pulmonary valve, then obviously the muscle become thick. The muscle mass will increases. You can relate this concept with the gym workout. When we work out in our gym, so then what happen, after a certain period of time, the bicep and triceps and body muscle will become broader and wider, because we are continuously stressing up our muscles. when muscle continuously getting so much stress, so slowly it will develop its overall capacity. So as we are stressed up our muscle in gym, so in that case our muscle mass increases. So you can relate the same concept here also. What happened here, as the right ventricle is continuously working so hard to push its content through the small opening, so slowly right ventricular wall will also become broader. So this condition is called ventricular hypertrophy. So in that condition is called ventricular hypertrophy. Ventricular hypertrophy is a condition when walls of our ventricle become wider because they are getting so much stress. So the fourth one is enlarged right ventricle. So the enlarged right ventricle is the ventricular hypertrophy, as we already discussed. So at last we can say that right ventricular hypertrophy is developed because of this kind of small opening which is present in our pulmonary artery. So as the pulmonary artery becomes tenuous, so openings is so small and our right ventricle, it has to work so forcefully and to push all its content towards our lungs, because there is a blockage, almost there is a blockage in between that part. So our right ventricle, it has to contract so forcefully so that it can push all its deoxygenated blood through this pulmonary artery towards our lungs. So this is called the enlarged right ventricle or ventricular hypertrophy. So overall we can now get the concept that intraventricular septal defects mean there is an opening in between both the ventricles. Aorta that emerges from both ventricles mean because of this opening, now functionally aorta is connected with our both the ventricles. A stenosis pulmonary valve means the opening is become narrower and there will be a less flexibility as both the cups will become thick. Initially it was so thin, so when right ventricle contract, both the cups will easily can move, but now because of the thickness they almost lost their flexibility. So the fourth one is enlarged right ventricle. Enlarged right ventricle means our right ventricle has to work so hard to push all its content towards our lungs, because at their part to lungs there is a stenosis pulmonary valve is present, and this valve is almost lost its flexibility. So that's why our right ventricle has to work or has to push its content forcefully. So slowly when each and every time during the contraction of our right ventricle working hard, so that's why this muscle become thick. So this is the main concept of tetralogy of Fallot. So hope you like this video and thank you.